Good evening. My name is George Osborne. I'm the chair of the trustees here at the British Museum. Welcome to this British Museum debate, which is in partnership with the Times newspaper. So thank you very much for coming together. A particular thanks to the panel, who Alice Thomson, who's going to chair this debate, is going to introduce for you. I just wanted to say something at the beginning about why we're having this debate. Why is this event happening at the British Museum? And it starts with a paradox. So you are in the most visited building in Britain. This building attracts 6 million people a year. That is more than the number of people who visit the city of Venice every year. And yet the question is posed, what's the point of this place and what's its role in the world and does it need to exist? Posed not just, it should be said, to our museum, but to other museums like it around the world. And that paradox, I think, stems from essentially the fact that this museum is both an idea of the Enlightenment, the first public universal museum in the world, not a royal collection like the Louvre or a religious collection like the Vatican, but a public museum established by the British Parliament in the middle of the 18th century. So it's an idea, and it's also a building, of course, and a collection, a physical collection. And with Nick Cullinan, who's here, our new director, newish director, who's doing a brilliant job here, we are trying to renew both the idea and the building. And so in terms of the building, we've just made what we think anyway is a very exciting announcement that a brilliant architect called Lena Gottner has won our international competition. And basically almost every architect you've heard of in the world entered this competition, and lots of up and coming stars did as well. And after a long process that took almost a year, we have, just in the last week, announced that Lena, who's a Lebanese-French architect who's done some terrific projects around the world, is going to be undertaking the project of the big renewal and rebuilding of the Western sculpture range, which is where the Egyptian statues are, where the Parthenon sculptures are, where the Assyrian treasures are, the bit that I guess people, really recognize when they think of the British Museum. That's a massive project, part of our big redevelopment of the museum estate. So we're renewing the building, but we're also renewing the idea behind this museum and its relevance in the world. And I think as chair of the trustees and with the other trustees and with the team of the BM, I think we all came to the conclusion, we know there's a debate happening about universal museums, about this museum, its place in our history and our world. Let's have the discussion inside our walls rather than pretending it's not happening outside of our walls, because this is a place of learning and a place where you hopefully arrive and then leave feeling a bit better about the world, or at least more informed about the world than you did when you arrived. So that's the purpose of this debate. Thank you so much for coming. I will remind you later, we're also going to give you all a drink afterwards. But at this point, I hand over to Alice, who's one of the stars at the Times, to chair this debate. And you've got to hand it to Alice. She's got quite a tough job keeping these four people in order. But I will know she will do it brilliantly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. I'm Alice Thomson. I'm a columnist and author at The Times, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here to the British Museum for this debate, which is in partnership with my paper. Tonight, the discussion is going to be whose history can museums preserve the past while addressing the present, which I'm not sure any of our panelists knew exactly what it meant, but we're all talkers. I'm going to talk the least, I hope, and all of you are going to not talk for more than 2 or 3 minutes at a time, I think you might say. Traditionally, museums have been seen as neutral custodians of art and culture, but in recent years, many have taken a more active role in addressing social and political issues, particularly those concerning historically marginalised and colonised peoples. Does judging the past through the lens of present-day values risk distorting history and alienating traditional audiences, or is it going to encourage new ones? Are museums lecturing or inspiring the next generation? And with me to discuss all this, I have Margaret Casely-Hayford, lawyer and co-founder and director of the Gallery of Living History. Tom Holland, in a very nice new suit. He is our award-winning historian and co-presenter of the phenomenally successful history podcast, The Rest is History. Sir Grayson, also in a phenomenally wonderful dress. one of Britain's best known and best loved contemporary artists. And he has told me he writes his own labels. So I'm really interested in that and how you've kept control and why. And then we have Simon Sebag-Montefiore, who is the internationally best-selling author and broadcaster, whose prize-winning books have been published in 48 languages. First of all, I'm going to ask all the panel briefly where and when they first went to a museum. Sebag, when did you first go to your museum?
I've no idea. I've been racking my brains. I can't remember anything from my early childhood, except I did love the National Portrait Gallery, where I'm now a trustee, amazingly, and I did love all those portraits of great leaders. But the really important gallery I visited in my youth was the Hermitage in Russia, in St. Petersburg. And that gave me a love of Russia and wanted to make me go back and to see it more and to visit it more and to write about it.
And what was it, the smells, the labels? What was it that you really loved about the museums?
It was the women in the coat check area who were wearing enormous coiffeured hairdos in red. And I remember one of them that the hair was melting down her cheek as it was boiling hot because everything in Russia was overheated. So that was my first memory really of a museum. And then once I left my coat, of course, I then enjoyed seeing all the paintings.
They were all very elderly, actually. I do remember. In fact, I took my son, who's now in the audience, to it, and we saw them. And what about you?
It's really hard to remember the first time I went to a museum, but I do remember that my mother, in summer holidays, would make it her mission to give us something cultural. And because it was 3 boys and 1 girl, it was very often something that she would have to focus the boys into. So I do remember going to the Bovingdon Tank Museum down here. Very, very well, because I just remember it was suitably interactive in allowing the boys to climb over the tanks. Actually, I don't know whether it was allowed, actually, they did.
But you didn't.
But I didn't. I mean, it was the great houses, the great gardens, Hampton Court and so on. And then also, because she worked for the British Council, she'd get invitations to private views of some of the chic Mayfair. So I do remember going to Gimple-Feast, which I don't think has existed for some time. It was in Mayfair and was gorgeous and very chic. And I remember as a young teenager going there, and made me feel it was the height of chic London.
What about you, Grayson?
We didn't go to many museums when I was a child. It wasn't really our thing. But when my parents were going through a very messy divorce, they thought, let's take the kids to London as a treat. And we came here and I must have been about 5 or 6. And I remember coming here, and I remember the man in the lift asked us, what was I interested in? And I said, I'm interested in models. And he said, go to the Egyptian department. They've got some model boats there. And I was terribly disappointed at the level of detail of the Egyptian funerary models. They just weren't up. They weren't nowhere near Airfix kits, And so I was terribly disappointed. Yeah. But it's amazing that I've still, fell in love with the museums in my life, considering its association with deep trauma.
And Tom, what about you?
It was on my 5th birthday, and I had recently become obsessed by dinosaurs. And my parents said there's a massive museum in London with a dinosaur in the main hall, namely the Natural History Museum. And I looked, they told me 3 months, I think, before, and I counted down the days to see it. And then I walked into, it's an amazing building, the Natural History Museum, and there was great Diplodocus. And then we went and looked at the plesiosaurs and the ichthyosaurs and various dinosaurs. And I came back completely buzzing. And my 6th birthday came and they said, what would I like to do for it? And I said, I'd like to go to the Natural History Museum. So we went and did that. My 7th birthday came. What would you like to do? Natural History Museum. My 8th birthday came. And by this point, I got into the Romans. And I said, I'd like to go and see somewhere where there's Roman stuff. So we came here. And by Romans, I'd got into it because of Asterix. So I was thinking Roman armor, gladiators, all the kind of, all that kind of stuff. And it was a massive, great pile of silver that had been found. It was an exhibition about late Roman silver, which wasn't quite what I'd been anticipating. But then I looked at it, and I was young, but I could tell this was very, very valuable. There was a lot of stuff there, and it opened my eyes to the wealth and the sophistication and the glamour of Rome like nothing else. And from that point on, I didn't jettison the Natural History Museum because I still love it, but the British Museum became the great focus of my devotion.
And Margaret, you're the only one who's set up a museum. How did you do it? And do you think it's easier to set it up from scratch so you don't have any of the baggage that goes before?
Well, gosh, the baggage didn't really impact on me in terms of being a restraint because it was a reaction. It was a reaction to, first of all, the murder of George Floyd. And secondly, it's because I was up until very recently Chancellor of Coventry University, slap bang in the middle of the country, the Midlands, and without the easy access for most people down in the southeast to the big museums, the big national museums. And so it was an idea that I came up with 3 friends, and essentially once we'd seen George Floyd killed, we realised that if the police officer had actually thought anything about this man as being a person who had rights and dignity, afforded him any respect, he might have had a different reaction. And so we were thinking about how do you make people see each other more in the round and understand their contribution to society. So essentially, we were trying to think about how you get people to think about history not being from perspective of kings and generals, and who made the wealth, who won the battles in reality. And so that's where it stemmed from. And so because we had no money, or very little money, we decided to make it virtual to begin with. And also, in terms of universality, we wanted it to be almost curated from bottom upwards. So we started off, and at that time we were actually quite worried that we would be described as woke.
Why were you worried about being woke?
Because essentially, if you're starting from the premise that you want to have a focus on Black people and on women and marginalised people, then essentially anyone who wants to criticise you is going to start with saying, oh, this is, to use the Daily Mail's wonderful phrase, asinine wokery, when it's actually, what it is actually saying to people who don't normally have an opportunity to be central to the story. So it's really trying to say to people, your forebears were actually relevant to the making of this city or this region or this country. And that was the reason for setting it up. And the first year we set up a children's competition, and essentially we asked them to design something that would celebrate someone who was marginalised or unrecognised. And the winning sculpture was wonderful because these year 10 students for Sydney Springer School decided that because Coventry had been bombed in the war, rebuilt, and it started from manufacturing, that they would celebrate everybody whose hands had contributed to making Coventry what it was. So they designed a tree with arms being the trunk, fingers being the branches, and then their own hands were moulded to make leaves. And it was incredibly moving. And I thought, these are children, and they know what it means to speak for everybody. And that, it's not just the accessibility, it's also speaking for everyone.
Tom and I went round Tate Britain last week with Hannah, who's helped to organise the event. And that's very different because that's a museum that's been there for a very long time, that has all sorts of history to it, and has just had a big rehang in 2023. And that, in a way, that was the other side, wasn't it? Because you were taking people who had been very much represented in history. But in some ways, the labelling's changed so much that you feel you're only getting the other side of history now.
Well, so there was a portrait there of someone who was definitely from a kind of marginalised order of society, the kind of person who would not normally be painted. This was a young woman, late 18th century, very poor background, had briefly worked as a servant girl, and then had become what I suppose in the late 18th century would be called a courtesan. And she is gazing out at you from the painting, and she is, according to the painting, dressed like Circe, the enchantress from the Odyssey, painted by a portrait painter called George Romney. And there are kind of hints as to her role as a courtesan. And her name is given as Emma Hart. So you have there the notion that she is physically attractive, she's from a marginalised background, and that she is posing in a kind of mythological manner. But what the caption does not tell you is her subsequent career, because she goes on to marry the ambassador, the British ambassador to Naples, Sir William Hamilton, which means that this former servant girl and prostitute becomes Lady Hamilton. And as Lady Hamilton, she becomes the kind of the cultural queen of Naples. And she becomes famous across Europe for her attitudes. She adopts kind of classical poses wearing wisps of gauze. And it's cultured and it's obviously very erotic. And it appeals to some of the most celebrated people in Europe, including Goethe, who fates her as the face of the classical. Now, of course, in due course, she becomes even more famous as the centre of Britain's most notorious ménage à trois, because she becomes the lover of Admiral Nelson, who gets off with her, am I allowed to use that phrase, after the Battle of the Nile, and probably Britain's most notorious sex scandal of the Regency period. But there is not a mention of this in the caption. And I assume that there is no mention of it, perhaps because, you know, she owes her title to marrying a man and her notoriety for her affair with another man. I don't know. But it does seem to me that knowing her subsequent career would massively enhance the interest of the painting for the casual visitor who may not know that Emma Hart goes on to become Lady Hamilton. And it does seem to me that an absolute prerequisite for rehanging and relabeling, say, paintings is that they should inform and interest. And when you have a portrait of one of the most interesting women in Regency Britain, to kind of completely erase that from the caption seems to me to be shooting yourself in the foot.
And Grayson, what about you? Do you think it should be left to the artists to decide how to reinterpret?
I mean, if they're alive, I mean, I like it because I'm fully aware I'm part of the entertainment industrial complex, and so I try to make people enjoy the thing, and I think politics, all art has politics in it by its very nature, and so that's fine. I'm happy with that. But I think the problem is when it becomes the headline. It's a bit like when celebrities model in fashion shows. It becomes about them rather than the clothes, and I think that. I go around quite often and I go, yeah, I agree with the politics, shit art though. Yeah, I agree with the politics on that one as well. Yeah, that's shit art as well.
Which one is more, the shit art or the politics?
Well, it's just that I go to, when I was doing my exhibition here, the curators quite often, they'd sort of get out this little sort of, Hindu god is from the 4th century and is incredibly important. And then they'd get out a piece of tat that they bought at a kind of a market in sort of 1980. And I go, well, that was much nicer. And that's the important one. No, I'm interested in that because that's my priority, was the aesthetics of it, And so I kind of suppose I understand that that we need to sort of rebalance the way we display things in museums. But for me, I'm an artist. I come to look at stuff, and so if the politics get in the way of the looking at it and the aesthetics of it and the enjoyment of it, and I think this is very important. This is something because quite often the tone of a lot of sort of political engagement with the culture these days is a little bit scoldy, is a little bit finger waggy, and finger wagging particularly from the left. I've got to say that's why you got Brexit and that's why you got Trump. It's the finger wagging, well-educated people. So I believe in what they're doing. I agree with everything they're doing. It's the tone, and you go to the museum on your day off. You want have some fun. You want to see some lovely things. You want to have an interesting story. You don't want to be, you've got to feel a little bit guilty looking at this.
Yeah, so when you see The Bailey Family by Gainsborough, what do you think? When you see that portrait, the Bailey family, Gainsborough one, do you want to know about the slavery connotations or do you not want to know? How much do you want to know, Grace?
I want to know. I think it's important that these things, because it's, for a lot of people, it's revelation, the kind of backstory of all these things. The gallery, the Tate Gallery, the clue is in the title, but so it's sort of like, I think that's important. It's just when it becomes sort of like a bit sort of like, all the time, I think, my biggest allergy is cliche, and a lot of the language around these sort of things has become a bit cliched. If you can convey the stories in a lively, interesting, novel way, great, because it's part of the art and it's part of the history. It's these things, and I'm all for it. But if it's just like, if it's like a dead weight on it, oh God, I've got to feel this is a good thing, but I'm not laughing, I'm not really enjoying it.
at the risk of throwing a grenade into the middle of Grayson's sentiment, I think that sometimes when people try to be light and fluffy, it can go.
Oh, no, I never said light and fluffy. I think you're for me, fun is a fundamental, because you're making the classic mistake that the opposite of serious is humorous. It isn't. It is triviality. And I think that fun is a very profound part of culture, and I want to see it everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not saying we shouldn't have fun, but I'm just thinking. Adrian Childs wrote an article that it keeps coming back to me because it was so ridiculously light, and it was in the Guardian a couple of weeks ago. And he said that he'd been to the British Museum at age 57 3/4, or however old he is now, a few weeks before, and he didn't know where to start. And someone had said, "Go into room 41." He went into room 41. It was just pots. And he said he ran through it, like as most of the tourists did, at speed of knots, because it was just really just not engaging. It wasn't interesting. He didn't. And then at the very end of this incredibly brief and really uninformative article, he said that he would go back. That was the best bit of it, because I want to go back with him and I want to hold his hand and I want to take him through. I don't know much about all of this because I'm not a trained artist, but I would say to him, ask yourself some questions. Ask yourself, what are the pots made of? Who made them? Why did they make them? Was it decorative? Was it full of some sort of administrative or institutional meaning? You know, was it a part of someone's ancestry? Is someone's great auntie Betty's ashes in there? You know, what on earth was it? Is it there for? And who curated it? Who bought it? Was it bought? Was it given? Was it given in inverted commas?
So you're someone who always reads.
I always read the labels and to the irritation.
But also the routes. You don't think actually you should look at the pot and think, is this a beautiful pot? I'm
Yeah, you can do that as well, obviously. But I just think that the rest of it is so important to who we are and who we could be and how it impacts on us as people, and indeed how we impact on others as well.
And Simon's, you are very, very good on individuals and people as well, and that we have that as much as objects. So particularly the National Portrait Gallery where you are, you've seen all these different individuals. Do you think we go too far with them? Do you want to look at the portrait and think, is this a beautifully depicted portrait, or do I like the technique of this, or do you want to know about the sitter? Is that more important to you?
Well, you have to know both, of course. I mean, I think the big danger, the big killer of entertainment and fun is like prudishness, self-righteousness, and above all, jargon. And so jargon is the killer. And jargon is also an interesting phenomenon in language, because as people like Foucault and other people have all said quite rightly, jargon is a way of being superior, of excluding people, of setting barriers for people to climb over. They have to use the jargon, they have to know it. So jargon is all about being a sort of member of a kind of little club, and you know, you're showing you belong by using it. And so jargon should be banned from all captions and in all
What's your word,
museums.
jargon?
Well, there's so much of it, but it's all about it particularly is on the history of slavery, and where it's constantly certain words are constantly used, and I think that what you want to say is what is happening, who the person is, where they come from, and you want to make it fascinating. I mean, for example, I think all sort of parts of all life should be covered in museums. So I think people from marginalized backgrounds, from all races, from all classes should appear in museums. But there is a way to do it, to make it entertaining, to make it fun. And I mean, for example, one of the most interesting things about William Gladstone is that, his father was the biggest slave owner in the British Empire. And that this man who became famous as the great liberal prime minister, he actually started off as a sympathizer, an apologist for slavery itself. And his father, when slavery was abolished, received the biggest compensation of any slave owner in the British Empire, which is a fascinating thing to know about Gladstone. But what I think is and I think Grayson touched on this when he said the name is in the title, there was a huge gap in museums where slavery was not covered. The origins of people's fortunes and careers in empire and in slavery were not covered. But for those of you who know about the history of the British Empire, I mean, everybody who was around at that time had some connection to slavery, to sugar, and therefore
When you say everyone was around at the time, it's everyone who had
everyone who
made
was around at the time who was in the establishment, who made money, who was in the aristocracy, everyone had some connection to this. And so does that mean one has to mention it on every single portrait? For example, in the National Portrait Gallery, does that mean one has to mention it in every single caption, in every single portrait? I think that is boring. And I think there are much easier ways to do it. Just have a caption to say that virtually everybody who was anybody at that time had some connection to large parts of the economy which were funded by slavery. And so I think that those are the key things. But I think that the key test is you've got to inform people without jargon. Another point about jargon, which again Grayson touched on with the fact that Trump has come in, the world changes. When we were doing the hang at the National Portrait Gallery, there was a lot of jargon involved. And in the end, we said, there should be no jargon. And thank God we did, because it's all out of date now.
Well,
no one's using the same jargon.
There is one I don't particularly, I have to admit, and James Marriott has written a column, because we both agree on this, that Samuel Pepys, one of our great diarists, was just called a sex abuser.
Well, no, he wasn't. Can I just interrupt you there? Because actually I have it in my pocket, that caption, because I did contribute to it. That. And actually, the fact that his sex life is an interesting thing about his diary.
And you say you want to be sensationalist.
And as Tom says, having Emma Hamilton without the sex, and without her career as a Troilist with the Nelsons, for example, and Sir William Hamilton, is to miss out the most interesting part of Emma Hamilton.
Ben Elton wrote a satirical novel about someone who was touring a show about Samuel Pepys, and it was all about getting cancelled. This was quite a while ago now.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether he was prescient or...
Well, I'll tell you what, I love James Marriott is a brilliant young columnist on the Times, and so who I think is one of the most outstanding young columnists of our time. So this is not a criticism of him, but in this case, he was being a little bit cheeky, because when I read his comment, I said, I'm sure I remember that caption, contributing a little bit to that caption on Pepys. Pepys is one of my great heroes. I think Pepys is one of the greatest stylists, writers, reporters ever to write in the English language. He commentated on some of the greatest events in British history, the Restoration, the Fire, the Plague, but he also recorded his own somewhat dodgy cases of sexual harassment, normally often of servant girls and so on. And which
time was it seen in that way? That's the problem, isn't it?
Well, I think at the time, at the time it was probably acceptable. He was certainly keeping a diary, but he kept the diary under code in secret, so he wasn't that proud of it, and it almost ruined his marriage. And of course, we condemn his behaviour absolutely. But the point about it is, in the caption of the beautiful portrait of Pepys, the first thing we say is, this is the greatest diarist in all of history. His diaries are a masterpiece. He recorded Charles II, James, and he saw the Duchess of Castlemaine's underwear hanging outside her apartments in Whitehall, and thought that was the most sexually erotic thing he'd ever seen. And he recorded all these fascinating things. He went and saw a dead queen in Westminster Abbey and kissed the body. He did all sorts of amazing things. He also ran the Admiralty. He was also a brilliant civil servant. If only we had civil servants like that now. And in the bottom it says, and he was also recorded his sexual molestation of girls, which we don't admire. End of story. You've got to have it all.
What do you say to that, Tom? Do you think
I'm
when you're going
impressed by the amount of filth we've already got in for the evening's conversation.
to you? Well, what about Sir Hans Sloane, who he set up this museum? All these people who actually gave artefacts to the museum, who spent their money. What should we think of them? How far do we go? Do you criticise them, or do you see them as an enlightened person who gave them money?
I think it is often assumed, you said that there's a sense that museums are seen as neutral spaces. I mean, clearly they're not. They are very culturally determined spaces. And there have been impulses over the course of history to collect. So there may well have been a museum in 6th century BC. We know that the Emperor Augustus had a collection of wonders on the island of Capri. And there were all kinds of collections of wonders in the Renaissance. But I think the kind of museums that emerge with the Ashmolean, with the Soane Museum, with the British Museum par excellence, is a product of particular cultural movements. And I would say the British Museum, you mentioned the idea of the universal museum. The British Museum is the exemplification of that. It's an embodiment physically and in terms of its exhibit of the Enlightenment ideal of being universal. And there are not many monuments, architectural monuments to the Enlightenment around, but this is one of the great ones. And I would say that in that sense, the British Museum with its collections is as culturally and historically significant as, say, the Parthenon. And that therefore, if you come here, you are not looking just at objects that tell you about the Romans or the ancient Indians or the Chinese or whoever. You are entering into something that is as expressive of its age as a medieval cathedral might be. And that in a sense, just as medieval cathedrals with the Reformation then have to be Protestantized, and there is a massive debate about how far should you go. I mean, should you whitewash everything? Should you get rid of all the kind of the flummery and the rood screens and all that kind of thing, or not? And there's a kind of via media emerges, which keeps a lot of the medieval aspects of the cathedral, but does Protestantize them. I think that something like the British Museum is culturally very analogous to that, because it is the embodiment of kind of the great animating ideals of the age. And in a sense, perhaps we are going through a process of reformation at the moment. And what people are debating is the degree to which the founding principles of, centuries before, how should we recalibrate them? It's the equivalent of how much, how many statues should we topple? How much whitewashing should we do? Which is exactly what the Protestant reformers faced.
But isn't there a constant recalibration? I mean, that's one of the really interesting things about this museum. It was built, you can see it was built as a testament to the greatness of the country. You can see that by the classical pillars and so on. It's a great country, it's the way it was seen. But if you look at the way in which the collection grew over time, you've got the response to the Grand Tour with the classes, and you've got the philanthropists who made huge amounts of money within industry, suddenly either deciding to give back or to whitewash their reputation, whichever way you'd like to look at it. Their contributions. So there's a constant recalibration, because even with some of the philanthropic donations, we look askance at them and think, how should we now view that? Because we're looking at things through a different lens.
We are, absolutely. And that's the key. We're looking at it through a different lens.
But that continues all the time. It's not.
But I think this is a new. I mean, the degree of recalibration is something greater, because you say that the British Museum is built to the glorification of Britain. I mean, it is, but it is above all built as a monument to the universality of human culture.
And therefore,
the fact that it is in London obviously redounds to the glory of Britain. But as people so often point out, the British Museum is not actually primarily or even mildly about Britain. Its focus is the civilizations of the whole world. And of course, today, the perspective would be that this is a monstrous example of European conceit, and perhaps of British conceit. But nevertheless, the ideal is one, I mean, that is the animating ideal. And so the question now for us as a country or as curators or whatever, is to what extent do we continue to uphold that founding ideal, the founding ideal that led to the creation of the British Museum, and to what extent do we interrogate it very profoundly? And that's why I make the analogy with the Reformation, because the Reformation was it drew on aspects of the medieval church, but it was also conscious of itself overturning shibboleths, toppling icons, whitewashing where there had been paintings. And I think something similar is happening now, that there has been a kind of moral revolution, perhaps since the 60s, and it's setting up kind of is a great earthquake, and the aftershocks are rippling out. And this is why it's so hard for people to keep on top of it, because every time you think you've worked out what the aftershocks have stopped, another one comes along. And as was it Simon said, I mean, the captions that you get, say, in Tate Britain at the moment are comically out of date. I mean, they read like they were written in 2020, which I imagine lots of them were.
They'd probably just tried to use. So you went to a Hugh Lock, which I think is fascinating here, because that is an attempt, isn't it, to update the British Museum. How did you feel about that? Did you think that was a fair way of looking at the British Museum? Now, did you like having two sets of labels? What did you think of it?
First of all, it was great that it was artist curated, because it meant we were looking at things through a different lens. But also it was the fact that he was contextualizing, and for me that's the most important thing, is contextualizing properly, so that we're actually seeing a fairer, a more rounded view of the artifact. Because I think that Tom's point's interesting, because I think the reason that we seem to be dealing with aftershocks is because we're not looking at what the change is that's actually fundamental to what's going on at the moment. It's about people. We're in an age in which we all feel everything's too big, it's too impersonal, and we're sort of fighting against the bigness of it all. And so what we're trying to do is to establish personhood, if I can call it that, in which individuals feel that they can have a voice, that they are respected. And in order to do that in an artistic context, in a museum context, we need to say to them, this is part of your story as well. And then we need them to think about how it's part of their story, so that they don't do silly things like say, oh, Hogarth sitting on a mahogany chair, and that tells you a lot about the slavery from whence the wealth came.
You're very good at this, Grayson. You managed to stand up in the middle of the earthquake. You're not falling over. You've got a sort of sense of self, haven't you?
Yeah, and I don't feel, I'm who I am, and I don't feel like I'm, when I go to a museum, I think one of the things we all do when we go to museums, whether we're aware of it or not, is we're looking for ourselves. When I did my show here, that was one of the sort of strap lines of the show, was we're looking for ourselves. And of course, I was given the privilege of literally finding myself, digging it all up. And when I laid it all out, I remember my wife came round before the show opened and said, oh, it's all got your handwriting. And these were all artifacts from the British Museum. And I think that the British Museum, I was a trustee here for 8 years. I mean, the main conversation that went on while I was a trustee, right from the get-go, was how can we reframe the museum to represent the world, the people who come here? And of course, that's going to cost £1 billion. This is a big thing. And going back to the sort of Tate Gallery and where does the money come from? One of the things I always offer museum directors, I'll do a big neon piece that goes outside your museum. It says, where do you think the fucking money comes from? Because this idea that there's this sort of clean source of money that will kind of like whitewash the entire culture. Is there some kind of scented candle and dungaree magnet that will kind of come along and kind of pay for all these things, and there won't be any kind of dirt at the end? Capitalism is exploitation, to a certain extent. And so I kind of like slightly say, maybe we should aspire so everybody feels like they can find themselves in the museum. That's a wonderful and good thing, and I want everybody to have the joy of museums that I have. But at the same time, maybe we need to kind of like be a little bit more resilient and say, yeah, the world's dirty. Look at all these people. They've all been fighting and warring and doing horrible things. And hate to tell you that, any historian will tell you that, it's still going on, and it will go on. It's a cyclical thing. I mean,
And actually, it's reassuring.
No, it's not. I don't find Putin and Trump reassuring.
I mean, it's long before modern capitalism emerges. It's right from the very beginning of settled civilization. The ability of civilizations to create the unbelievably impressive statuary and friezes and structures that you find in the British Museum is founded on systemic exploitation. And that is one of the first things you learn when you come to the British Museum, is that the more imperious and autocratic an imperial civilization may be, the more impressive its artifacts look in a museum. And I guess that one of the things that anyone who goes to a museum that is full of artifacts from ancient civilizations comes to recognize very early on is the Walter Benjamin observation, what is it, that there is no document of civilization that is not also a document of barbarism. And I mean, I entirely accept the point that we do want to see ourselves perhaps reflected in what we see in a museum, but actually that's not primarily what I want to see. I want to see stuff that is kind of weird and unsettling and terrifying and thrilling, because when I went to the Natural History Museum when I was 5, I didn't want to see a cow. I didn't want to see a sheep. I wanted to see a dinosaur. And when I come to the British Museum, often I want to be unsettled. I want to think about how strange, how unlike me human beings have been, because I think that what the British Museum and, you know, the Louvre and all these kind of great would-be universal museums do is to remind us of how infinite the ways are of being human.
You're absolutely right, but we still need to learn and relearn as we do more work and understand better. So, for example, if you look at the way in which we've looked at Egypt and what and some of the wonderful artifacts here, and we look at the making of the pyramids, and we talk about the fact that they were made historically by we said by enslaved people, and now we're saying no, that's my point. Now we're saying no, we've done more work and they weren't made by enslaved people. That's what I mean by contextualizing. We need to continue looking and learning and just setting things in better context. That's what I mean. I'm not saying that it's got to be about...
I agree. But I think that part of the fascination of ancient Egypt is precisely that it's so weird and so unlike us.
And so Simon, with you, with the National Trust has had probably the most problems with this. They had a big report into colonialism and historic slavery. Do you think that that's now settled down? Do you think that was the right thing for them to do? Do you think we need these huge shifts, or?
Sure, but I mean, it's like this work's all been done now, and we don't need now to go into a permanent cultural. It's not even a cultural revolution. It's become humdrum. It's like producing, every institution in Britain is now spending millions producing more reports on the connections of patrons and the British aristocracy with slavery. I don't want to say this, but this is now no surprise. We now know this is a case. Even people who didn't know it before, but most us historians, we are totally unsurprised by these findings. So it's no revelation, and
is this just mirroring how we're teaching children history now? Do you think? Do you think a different way of teaching? Are you worried about that?
I just think we need to, in museums, I think they need to be living things. They need to reflect the time. We need to avoid endless judgments that reflect the present, because, A, because the present isn't as interesting as the past, and B, because they're constantly changing, as we've said. And I mean, there are various parts of history, like anthropology, for example, where they always reflect the more absurd parts, or because there's so little known about the earliest moments of human existence. They so often reflect the latest fashion in present sociology, if you like, and we just need to avoid that. We need to, if there are bad things to say about money, Grayson's right. Money is filthy, and Balzac was right. Behind every great fortune there's a great crime, and we should just, as time passes, we should just acknowledge the crime and enjoy the donation. And then, of course, then you come to the artists themselves, and a lot of them are also pretty filthy. And if you look at, and I don't mean Grayson in this, but if you look at Wagner,
I do leave with my secret.
We'll come to you in a minute, Chris. You can reveal, but you look at
Picasso, or
you look at Wagner or Picasso or
Eric Gill,
or Cormac McCarthy, or you name it. I mean, the thing is, like, what are we going to do? Throw away all this great art, or Michael Jackson? We're not going to listen to Billie Jean anymore. No, we just acknowledge We acknowledged that they had complex lives.
Grace,
And,
do you
and
have
enjoy
a news life? How much do you want people to know? Do you want people to know everything about your life?
No,
We'd like to know a bit more.
I put on a very authentic look of being incredibly open.
But you're married to a psychologist, so it's even more complicated, isn't it? Because she does tell us a bit about you, doesn't she?
Yeah, I'm fine. I am an open book. Yeah, it's fine. But it's. But I mean, you know, there's a dark side, especially to men. You know, I always think the news should start with what shit have men been up to today. Because, yeah, I mean, it's literally the elephant in the room quite often, isn't it?
Absolutely, but I think that's an incredibly powerful point, that we all have a dark side, and for some it's darker than others. And I just think we shouldn't shy away from that. It's
But it's you putting children off. If you say everything they see, that there's always going to be a dark side, that they
no, it's reality. It depends on how you do it, of course. But you don't force it down their throats. But it's just a question of being grown up about it. I mean, I think the idea of saying that Churchill walked on water and because he led us through a war successfully is naive, and we have to recognise that there's more to him than that. I have to recognise the past of my family. Richard Brew was a slave trader from County Clare, who was probably one of the foremost slave traders on the west coast of Africa. He went to live at Anamabu and married a Ghanaian chieftain's daughter. So my family has him in
see you're both.
as well as the abolitionists and the anti-colonials, the Pan-Africans. So I've got that, and I'm quite comfortable about looking at both sides and saying, this is me, this is who I am. And I just think we should all be grown up about it, because otherwise, if you continually hide the reality, you'll never mature, you'll never move forward. And that is part of what this is about. I mean,
Does it put you off when you're looking at art? So if you see someone and they are a sexual abuser or this, does that put you off the art in any way or not? Or do you just think that's a more complex?
Depends how much I like the art.
Okay.
Because I
You're looking.
but I tend to look at art. I'm more like to be inspired by something in this building than in the Tate Modern. And so most of the people that made the things in this building are anonymous. That's why I called my show that, the Tomb of the Unknown Craftsman, because I know that all of the civilizations, as we've discussed, that produced all this beauty and wonder and craftsmanship, they were all pretty brutal, in many ways. And you kind of go, yeah. And nowadays, it's a safer world we live in, hopefully, but it's also, so we're more touchy about it. But there is a dark side. We've all got a dark side. The more we acknowledge it, the more healthier it is.
Is there anyone who's gone too far? Is there any artist you thought, I just can't tolerate that?
Oh, I mean, you could say, I don't know, like Eric Gills is the one that often comes up to mind, that people get very cross because that's the sort of red flag. But I always think that people, we're all born good, is one of the things I always say. We're all born good, and then we're fucked up by our families, and we do terrible things, Hitler included, And it's let's look at ourselves a little bit as well here. But it's never been a great sort of. I've never been torn looking at something going, they do terrible things, because normally most of the art I like is by nice people.
I think, can I just say, I think the thing about Hitler was he wasn't fucked up by his family. He was overloved by his family. He was overindulged by it. He was loved too much by his mother. And it's okay to discuss him here because, of course, he was an artist.
But that's still
a very bad
that's
one.
a form of fucking up.
A very bad one, but he was an artist.
Isn't overindulgence a form of fucking up?
Yeah, well, you can
And then
love
what
people
about, do you
too
think
much.
that you should look at the art first, Tom, or would you always go for the history first? So if you look at Constable's Haywain, it's referred to as a contested landscape. Do you want to know that before you look at the Haywain, or do you want to think?
So I'm not doctrinaire about it.
Right.
My mood might vary. I might be interested in the aesthetic impact of a painting, or I might want it placed in a historical context. And to be honest, I'm happy to be guided by the curation, as long as it is interesting. if I feel that I'm being lectured at, if I feel that things are being cut out, if I feel it's frankly boring, then that's disappointing. But I am very open to being challenged and surprised, because that's part of what going to a museum, I think, should be about.
Have you walked out of a museum ever?
I mean, I have gone to museums and thought, this isn't really for me, and I've been bored. And I guess that is not what a curator wants, is to feel that people going to their museums
I mean, that's
are boring.
yeah. So I felt,
But obviously, there are certain things that I'm interested in that other people wouldn't be, and that's the way it is.
so I felt that was, say, the Science Museum, when there's been this big controversy. Obviously, the media have stoked it, but the Science Museum said that Lego was anti-LGBT, and they did that. We loved that story because it was obviously huge headlines for us. But on the other hand, it did make more people go to the Science Museum.
It did. So
Maybe that's the point.
Yeah, I often wonder about that, whether curators say things that will get their show.
But if you're too if you're too serious, really, or as you say, if you're too strict,
You see, the thing is, it's not even that. You can be deathly serious, because actually the impact of a museum doesn't always have to be fun or amusing to be overwhelming. So I remember going to the Holocaust Museum in Washington and going round that, and it was a horrible, horrible experience. And then I remember walking into this room, and there was a boat, a kind of rough fishing boat on the wall. And I went up and read the caption, and it said, "This was a boat used by a Danish fisherman to carry Jews over to Sweden to get them out of Denmark when the Nazis were cracking down." And I began weeping, because up until that point, the horror had been so overwhelming that there was no place for tears. And I looked around and I saw that 4 other people were exactly the same. And that is also part of what a museum can do. I don't think anybody would say that going to the Holocaust Museum is exactly fun, but it can broaden your sense of the horrors that humans are capable of. But also, when that shard of light comes in, it can give you a sense that we're not just monsters. I mean, since we've been talking a lot about slavery, there's a very good exhibition that opened, I think, over the weekend at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge that I went to, about abolition and the fight against slavery, which is full of nuance and complexity. And again, I wouldn't say, it was fun, but it was powerful and stimulating. And I came out of it having had my thoughts on the process of abolition complicated and enlarged. And there was one particular painting that I was vaguely aware of, a painting of a black scientist who had been nominated for the Royal Society by Newton and by Halley. And he had been turned down because of his complexion, it was said. And then he had gone back to Jamaica, and there was this strange painting that had long been thought to be maybe a kind of caricature or a mockery. But there was an excellent article in the LRB in November, which I hadn't seen, but which I went and read after seeing this picture, that argues it was painted by someone who was an artist who had a very distinctive style, who was very committed to abolitionism. But it is complicated, because this black scientist, and there he is in his periwig and his frock coat, and you've got Halley's comet outside, because he's one of the first people to work out that Halley had been correct in his forecast of the comet. But how had he been able to go to London and study there, and how had he come back and been able to set up as a gentleman? Because his family owned slaves. And that, and I felt challenged and stimulated, and I felt I knew more as a result of going for that exhibition. But I wouldn't say that I enjoyed it.
But I think that there's something really important about allowing the door to be open to the darkness. And I mean, if you think about the way Bristol and Liverpool have dealt differently with their slave past, with Colston, there was a constant putting a lid on things, and then there was that awful eruption and when the statue was pulled down and people pretty much rioted about it. And Liverpool, I think, because of it's got a very complex history, is trying to face into this in a much more consultative fashion with the redevelopment of the Liverpool National Maritime Museum and the Slavery Museum. The Slavery Museum, which I laughed when I first found out, was in the basement of the Maritime Museum, which, and I can't believe that the irony of that hadn't been seen. But anyway, fortunately, the new design, which is actually rather spectacular, has the Slavery Museum having its own entrance. But because of the importance of slavery and the way it's shaped the way that people look at people like me, even now, and the way we're treated and the way our history is expunged and the way we're marginalized to this day, it is really important that it should still be given a big reference. But what is really good about this about what they're trying to do in Liverpool is the fact that they are focusing on slavery. They're also focusing on the fact that, for example, 6% of the fleet between 1807 and 1833 was devoted to trying to suppress the slave trade, so that that part of the Navy's history is also a focus. And that's what I mean by contextualizing. I'm not saying that it should all be pointing a finger and saying you're terribly wicked and we hate you, you white rich person. It isn't about that at all. It's all about all of us finding out about all of our history so that we all understand things in the manner we feel part of this. I'm British, and I found myself, I was in a really strange situation, rather like this. I was being asked about the British Constitution, which I think is a thing of wonder, and the fact that a great part of it is unwritten, is completely superbly precious. And I wanted to talk about it with all the fervour that I normally do around a dinner table, and I suddenly thought, am I allowed to?
And why? Do you think that changed in the last?
And I think that is an awful thing for somebody. Well, no, has it changed? I don't know whether it's changed. It's just personally, I just thought, I'm sitting here as the black person in this room. I don't know whether I'm allowed to talk about the British Constitution in this way. And then I thought, oh, for heaven's sake, you're probably the oldest person in the room. So you've been living under the British Constitution for, decades.
And is that because of the cultural?
It's because yes, absolutely. I mean, marginalization isn't something that we're progressing in a positive way in a linear fashion. It ricochets back all the time. And at the moment, the ricochet back so fast that it's almost making our teeth fall out. It's quite terrifying.
And do you feel that, Sebag, you see it, because you can see it more than being Jewish, you see a whole different aspect that's coming, don't you? That you see the racism in different ways.
Well, I was just going to say, I was recently in Thomas Jefferson's house, Monticello, in Virginia, and some of the presentation of it has been, some of the captioning and the sort of presentation of it is completely now dominated by slavery, and sort of Paul Thomas Jefferson, slave owner, but also great man of letters, great politician. Some of him has been kind of overwhelmed by the fashion for fascination with slavery and the concentration on slavery. But on the other hand, the Jefferson case is interesting, and I was looking at this when I was walking around it, because actually his story is so extraordinary, and we've all been talking about how to make this stuff interesting. The fact that his wife died, his wife was a big slave owner, and that he then brought over to France, where he was ambassador, the 14-year-old half-sister of his wife, who was also owned by his wife and was a slave. And she was described as a very beautiful girl. And when Adams, the future president, saw her and met her in London, he said, "Oh my God, we've got to send her straight back to America on the next boat. We can't possibly let her go and stay with Jefferson in Paris." But off she went, and then Jefferson had, I think, 6 children with her. And it's such a mixed story, but it's just gives you an idea of the complexities of slavery, and the moral dilemmas and confusions of slavery that this situation could happen. And I think that in that story alone, you get a much better. You were talking about how you're descended from both slave owners, maybe slave traders, maybe slaves themselves. And you just realize that, what you want to discover when you read captions about slavery is how complicated this world was. Tom's touched on it as well, with his scientist. And I think that, that's one thing that I did sort of pick up in my Jefferson experience. And that was a great museum. Of course, a house museum is also a great joy, another subject to discuss when it's actually built around one person's house is also fascinating.
And just before we open up the questions, I want to ask Grayson, you've got a show coming up, The Delusions of Grandeur. Are you doing all your own labelling for that? And what can you just give us a tiny taste of it?
Well, because it's at the Wallace collection, and I had to come up with a strategy because I was asked if I wanted to put on an exhibition there that kind of worked with the collection. And I realized after sort of wandering around it day upon day, looking at the collection, that I didn't love a lot of the collection. I like the idea of the Wallace collection and stuff. So I was like going, wow, this is an amazing collection. But it didn't get my artistic juices flowing in the way that many of the artifacts in this great museum did. And so I had to so I invented an artist who did love the Wallace. And I was off. Shirley Smith. She's called Shirley Smith. And yes, you'll learn about her in the, but yeah, so she actually crops up on the audio guide and everything.
And how old is she?
She's dead now. She was born in 1930. But yeah, I had to come up with a way of doing it, and then allowing myself to do the things. But
did she have good taste or not? Maybe not.
Well, everything that I touch has good taste associated with it in my eyes. I mean, good taste is that which does not alienate your peers. So it's the idea that any one group has good taste is an anathema. I know that's a shock to many middle-class people here, but yeah, it's a group cohesiveness taste. So each culture, each group in society has their own taste diktats, which we might find abhorrent.
And which change all the time.
Yeah, totally.
Which is what we're talking about.
And so finally, we've got a more in common poll for this debate, which shows that the majority think museums should present historical exhibits based on the ethical standards of their time rather than applying any moral judgment. So I'd quite like to hear from all of you how you feel about it. Is there anyone who wants to ask anyone, either specifically or to the panel, questions now?
I work at a living history museum, and I just wondered what the panel felt about that. I'm an interpretation manager at an open-air museum, better known as the location for the repair shop and the Wealdon Downland Living Museum. And we have interpreters who do live interpretation. So that's ploughing, making crafts, doing domestic work, that sort of thing. And we haven't talked about that at all. I know we're in the British Museum. But I'm just interested in what you thought about that.
I had one of my most profound, beautiful experiences in a museum, which is near Oslo, the Folk Museum there, which is a park, basically, where they've rebuilt buildings, a bit like your built museum, I think, where they've rebuilt buildings going right back to kind of medieval times in this park. And I walked into this one thing, and it was a guest house from a kind of, I think it was a 16th century farm. And it was completely original. They'd somehow got this building with all the furniture and all the artifacts in it. And the docent who was looking after and guarding it, she was dressed in traditional costume and knitting in the corner of the room. And there was a fire burning in the grate, and it was a lowering kind of November day. And I just walked into the past with my body, and I had this bodily experience of the past. And it was so profound. It was beautiful. I just wept at it. And I think that those sort of museums can do that, and when you recreate the past and you get that material culture at that level, when it's perfectly done, because for me as an artist, that's the only time I've walked in and thought there's nothing, there's no labels, there's no plugs, there's no lighting, nothing is wrong. It was literally like walking into the past.
So last Easter, we went, myself and my wife went to Skara Brae in Orkney. And, it's these very, very ancient Neolithic, it's kind of like a hobbit hole the top has been sliced off like an egg, and you can see inside it, and built out of stone. And there were they looked like kind of cupboards and beds made out of stone. and you felt very, very close to them. But of course, it's exposed to the elements, and it required a feat of imagination to think of what it would have been like to live in somewhere like this. And then we drove off, and I don't really know whether I should say this. I'd probably edit this bit out. But there's a place in Orkney called Twat, and we wanted to photograph ourselves in front of a signpost. And we drove round and round. We realised that all the signs with this name had been removed precisely because loathsome tourists like us were turning up and having our photos taken. And while we were looking for it, we came across this. It was quite a kind of handwritten, smudged piece of paper saying 17th century farmhouse, free. And so we thought, oh, we'll go and see that. And it was indeed a 17th century farmhouse that had been perfectly preserved, had not been done up. And I imagine the impact was rather like the medieval house that you went to outside Oslo. But the thing I remember about that was walking in, there was a fire. There'd be not a hint of the 21st century about it. And they had exactly the same stone layouts that we'd seen in Skara
Oh, wow.
And it was the eeriest thing. I mean, I will never forget it. The synergy of having seen this Neolithic building and then this 17th century farmhouse that had been, I mean, they must have made it try and make it look a bit more 17th century with fires and things like that. But goodness, it was powerful.
Simon, have you been to one?
No, but I love the sound of it because I'm fascinated. I can't do anything. I can't even make toast. I can't change a plug. So I just love the fact that there are people who can do all these amazing things. And one of the things we forget today is that so many skills now have been destroyed by the Industrial Revolution and by manufacturing. So no one anymore can sort of make thatch roofs or build boats or any of these things. So I'm just awestruck by anyone that can do any of these things. So I love the sound of your museum.
I'm a trustee of the Radcliffe Trust, and one of the joys is that when we give grants, we go off to see where the grant money's gone to, and we did give some money to the wonderful place in which you work. And so we went off and had a fabulous day, but it was bitterly cold, which was actually really, really helpful because I so fell in love as we got back in time, further and further back into increasingly less sophisticated environments. I thought, I want to live here, I want to live here. And then I got so cold to my, really into my bones. I thought, actually, no, I don't. So it was very curative, juvenile romanticism.
Trustees of museums, how do you choose which private donation to take, and secondly, which donation to give back?
Yeah, I've been on the board of a few museums, and yeah, there is a point. All museums sort of like draw up a kind of series of red flags, and I've actually sort of met donors, and we've gone, like this, and it's. So I think, that people are intensely, but also, of course, museums have an obligation in the present funding climate to accept any legal money. I mean, this very place has, had many debates with a sort of petrol, with oil companies and things like that. It's not illegal to produce petrol. But there's so there's a kind of soft boundary around these things about sort of where do you draw the line? Because if are you going to mend the roof without that money? And it's very difficult to get a glamorous philanthropist to put their name in gold on the air conditioning system. And so, there is a kind of pragmatic thing in museums that they'll take. But, all museums have red flags about the kind of people and regimes and characters that they will not. But I would look at the websites at some of the names you see around some of our institutions and find out, if a kind of armoured personnel character leaps out on the front page.
And Todd, if we're going to have free museums, which we are, more than anywhere else in Europe, you can just walk into a lot of our museums still. That is extraordinary in many ways. Is there then a sort of quid pro quo that you have to take money from some sponsors to do it?
I guess so. I mean, it's a very tough climate. And if we want museums to be open and be free, as Grayson said, people who make lots of money they're not always angels. I mean, generally my presumption is that if someone is fabulously rich, they're probably not an angel.
What about you, Sam? What about the Russians? I mean, you've done so many books on Russia. What happens with them?
I mean, it's just an impossible question. I mean, I think everyone's answered it much better than I could. But I think that you just got it. You need funding for these institutions, and you don't want to take it from raving murderers. But on the other hand, if you start excluding in a sort of vortex of righteous witch hunting, and you start excluding everybody who's vaguely, indirectly invested in something down distantly in the road, in sort of in minerals or something, then we're going to end up with no literary festivals, no museums, and everything's going to close, and we're actually going to shoot ourselves in the foot out of ideological fervor. So there is a balance here, and I think it's very hard to find it, but I'm generally for raising funds for places like the British Museum and literary festivals and other things, and as I said, just avoiding mass murderers if possible.
I mean, on that topic, it's often said that more people go to museums than go to football matches. And I think that Premier League clubs provide us with a litmus test that Newcastle United is owned by the Saudis, and the Saudi government, or at least a certain representative of it, was responsible for chopping up a Saudi dissident and smuggling bits of his body out in a suitcase. And so I think that as long as the bar is set below that, it's probably all right.
But can I just say, talking of that,
Sacklers then or not, Alice? Does that include the Sacklers then, do we think, or not? The Sacklers, do you think they're beyond?
I haven't read the book about it, so
Alice, I think the thing is, I think talking of the early kind of versions of museums, I mean, of course, those were the Kunstkammers, the cabinets of curiosities, where people put what is now totally unacceptable, things like dwarfs and babies born with their heads joined together and so on and so forth. And Peter the Great founded his Kunstkammer, which he was very proud of. And he had actually executed all sorts of people, including
to put them in the museum.
not for the not to provide an exhibition for his music, but they doubled as that. He thought that was a secondary use of the people he executed. And for example, I think in 1618 he executed Mary Hamilton, who was a distant relative of the Hamiltons that we were talking about earlier, and she was an incredibly beautiful woman that he had actually slept with, but she was caught aborting babies, and therefore he took her out to be executed, and she believed that she'd be pardoned because she knew the emperor so well, but he didn't forgive her, and she was beheaded. And so he put her everyone said was the most beautiful head they'd ever seen. And by the way, because he was obsessed with medical anatomy and was a student of anatomy, he held up her beautiful head to the audience in St. Petersburg and gave an anatomical guide to the throat and aorta and all this kind of stuff. And even the Russian audience was kind of virtually fainted with horror at this. And they were pretty hard. And anyway, my point is that he then put her head in the Kunstkammer where people could see it. And it was there as an exhibit, and it was there for about 40 years until Catherine the Great took it out. But I'm just saying, Tom, you set me off there. But forgive me. But there are limits to what you can put into exhibition.
And Margaret, do you have any limits?
I've been on boards that have thought about they start the year and you have your policies, you adopt your policies, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, and then suddenly had to do a bit of a slight volte-face. And the best one was we were thinking about whether we could where we would invest our money on one particular board, and we decided not in weapons and tobacco and etc. And then the Russians invaded Ukraine, and everyone sort of said, "Oh, possibly weapons are not that bad."
Any more questions? Well, and in fact, I think we're now out of time. And thank you very much to all of you, Tom, Grayson, Sebag, and Margaret, for answering pretty much every question. And really just, infusing us with why we come to museums, why we love coming to museums, why we should all be going out tonight. I mean, it's a pity it's not open all night, the British Museum, because we could all wander around.
Museums at night are the most exciting thing.
Yeah.
I have camped in some museums.
Of course, they
That's
made a movie about that, of course. But yeah.
Well, thank you all very much for coming, and thanks to the British Museum and to the Times and to Ben for setting it up at the Times, and to all of you for coming. And there are now going to be drinks in the Enlightenment Gallery for the next hour, if anything would like to come.